Every medium has its different appeals to creatives. There are always advantages to telling a story in each individual one. Whether it be a movie, a comic book, a video game, or a TV show, video games have possessed an advantage over other mediums in narrative ability for well over 10 years. Player agency's role in storytelling continues to change the way we connect with characters. In the genre of narrative-driven games, forming connections to characters happens differently than anywhere else. Naughty Dog have found the best ways to use this medium to their advantage since 2007. You can often track where certain projects had a ripple effect on how others choose to create, moments where there are shifts in the industry. Naughty Dog's seminal work on Uncharted Drake's Fortune made these waves that have kept crashing at the same impact since the first break. The decision to design a game using inspiration from film, or more specifically the action film genre, set something in motion.
You can't stop this.
The uncertainty of games such as The Last of Us translating to TV or film is always going to be driven by that same lack of player agency. When it comes to the industry's most renowned stories, the question of how good is this story when removing that agency is present on everyone's mind. There has been ongoing discourse for years on the quality of writing going on in the video game space. Uncharted, The Last of Us, God of War, and others are not the C-tier movies some perceive them to be should they leave the medium. The defining factor in a faithful translation is the inclusion of the correct people. The Last of Us on HBO required Neil Druckmann to ensure its success matched its potential. Including those who were so involved in the creation of these stories in their video game forms should be a requirement so the translation functions as intended. Deep knowledge on where player agency is given and when to take it away can only come from those who have lived within the development environment of such features. Time plays a very important role in our ability to connect with characters. The length of time spent with characters differs greatly from game to TV. The most important parts of a narrative-driven game often happen in conversations during gameplay that take place in between key cutscenes. When creating an adapted show, they face the challenge of having to condense the most standout interactions that took place in natural exploration. The player no longer gets to dictate their own pace. A show chooses which of your curiosities will be satiated. You don't get to seek them out as you see fit. The amount of time you spend with the characters is set in stone the moment you hit play. When taking matters into your own hands in-game, there is a level of control that cannot be replicated elsewhere. The progression of Joel and Ellie's relationship is given so much room to breathe because you have a role to play in deciding how long it takes to develop. Neil Druckmann and Craig Mazin finding a way to present this same growth without feeling suffocated by an increased pace is special. The strength of Joel and Ellie's bond might vary a bit to the individual depending on how much of the game's optional moments are sought out. It stands on its own in cutscene interactions, but they allow you to go further if you want to. AAA game development at the level Naughty Dog develops at takes a long time, and the gap between sequels isn't closing anytime soon. What was once somehow a 2-year wait in between a trilogy of Uncharted games is no longer feasible when trying to set industry benchmarks with every release. The Last of Us Part 2 was released 7 years post the launch of Part 1 in 2013. Joel and Ellie's story had already captured a far larger audience than was thought to be possible in its debut form. Giving your audience 7 years to sit with these two characters creates an attachment that TV shows will have a harder time finding, even if it is completely unintentional. The showrunners had hard decisions to make that were going to be controversial until proven otherwise. The infected play far less of a role in TV format than they do in game, mostly due to the nature of them being largely a part of gameplay. The feeling of danger that infected impose on one is measured far differently between the two. It's harder to sell that the infected are a force to be reckoned with in a live-action setting due to the needed believability from a new audience. The infected are a far more threatening presence in the second game. The choice to have a lack of consistent violence in the first season of the show works to its advantage as the events of the first game progress. The first game's most horrific moments are elevated constantly by a new viewer being trained to expect a less gruesome outcome. Having the infected encounters be far and few between makes them far more threatening in the long run. There is serious groundwork being set for the events of Part 2 as they translate to TV. A tone has been set in Season 1 that the world of The Last of Us isn't as dangerous as you think it is. Terrible things happen, but the first season focuses much more on how humans respond to one another in the midst of world-ending events. It's a very compelling deception. For those on the side of the conversation that know what fast approaches, you have that edge watching the show. Both the new and old consumer get an equally uncertain experience, one that will continue as they catch up to the events of the game. The Last of Us Part 2 is in complete contrast to the first game. The majority of the show's current viewer base are blissfully unaware of the complete 180 the tone of the story takes. Telling the story of Part 2 now requires that the lack of violence be rectified. It's only a matter of time until the conversation shifts and the quieter moments are in high demand. Ellie is a hurt and vicious character as the narrative progresses, and as a result, The Last of Us Part 2 is arguably the most realistically violent video game ever made. It's a complex enough situation to navigate making the game translate perfectly to TV. Part 2 heavily leans into the fact that it is a video game using every advantage that it has access to. It contains a structure that does not work as is when removing it from its medium and pasting it into another. While Neil and Craig were able to fully realize Part 1's pace and messaging, The Last of Us was a game with a very straightforward story that was easy to casually consume. It still contained impressive character depth around every corner, but it didn't jump around. When comparing it to what was accomplished in its sequel, it will be a vastly harder challenge to pull off in a TV format from this point forward. Part 2 as an overall experience doesn't have many parallels to Part 1. The first game is very consumable on a surface level and doesn't ask much of you to understand and wrap your head around it, whereas Part 2 only offers the opposite. It wants to challenge everything you believe about its world. At every turn, it requires you to consider everyone's angle beyond the surface level, something a lot of people don't practice outside of games. Asking them to do it within is a risky task, but a worthwhile one. You're either going to love it or you're going to hate it. There isn't often an in-between. You weren't indifferent, and that's exactly what they wanted. Creating a story that inflicts this amount of damage a second time and in another medium will not be easy. But if HBO's The Last of Us showrunners and cast have demonstrated anything, it's that they're more than up to the task.